After months of silence, her parents' soul, who walked into the restaurant, stopped scrolling for just 30 seconds, because what you're about to hear will remind you why some people refuse to give up, even when the world tells them it's time to let go. Picture this. An elderly couple walks into the same restaurant every single Sunday for months, and they always reserve 3 seats. But here's the twist that'll break you: only the chairs ever get filled. Week after week, they show up like clockwork, ordering food for someone who never comes, keeping a promise to a daughter who stopped answering their letters months ago. Other diners whisper, call it sad, maybe even a little crazy. But what if I told you that their refusal to give up wasn't denial? It was the most powerful act of love you'll ever witness. See, here's what nobody wants to admit about waiting. We live in a world that worships instant gratification, where 3-day shipping feels like an eternity and unanswered texts trigger panic attacks. We've been trained to move on quickly, to let go and let God, to accept reality and stop torturing ourselves with false hope. And yet, there's something deeply human, something almost sacred about the people who refuse to stop believing, who keep setting that extra place at the table even when logic screams that it's over. This isn't a story about foolishness. It's about what happens when duty calls someone away, when sacrifice demands separation, and when love decides that silence isn't the same as surrender. What happened on that particular Sunday evening will challenge everything you think you know about faith, patience, and the power of showing up even when your heart is shattering into a million pieces. Because sometimes the universe rewards the stubborn ones, the believers, the parents who understand that honor means keeping your promises even when the person you made them to seems lost forever. So, if you've ever waited for someone, if you've ever held on to hope when everyone else had moved on, if you've ever wondered whether love can actually outlive distance and doubt and devastating silence, this story is for you. The corner table by the window had become something of a shrine, though no one dared say it out loud. For months now, every Sunday evening at 6:30 sharp, the same elderly couple would walk through that door with shoulders just a little heavier than the week before. The hostess knew better than to ask any more. She'd simply nod, grab 3 menus out of habit, and lead them to their spot. But here's the thing about waiting. It changes you in ways you don't notice until you catch your own reflection mid. The father would pull out his wife's chair first, then his own, and finally, with a tenderness that could break stones, he'd adjust the 3rd chair just slightly, as if preparing it for someone who might arrive any second. That empty seat wasn't just furniture anymore. It had become a placeholder for hope itself, a physical manifestation of the promise their daughter made before her deployment. When I return, dinner's on me. You see, duty and love don't always walk hand in hand. One has to wait while the other march. The uniform folded on the chair at home, the boots by the door that hadn't moved in months, the flag on the table in the living room. These weren't just objects. They were anchors keeping a family tethered to belief when logic whispered otherwise. Every Sunday, the mother would glance at that 3rd place, setting the untouched water glass, the folded napkin, the menu lying face down, and something inside her would crack just a little more. Her husband would reach across and squeeze her hand, a silent language they'd perfected over months of practiced waiting. The waitress, young and kindred, had stopped asking if they were expecting someone. She'd learned that some questions sound too much like you. Instead, she'd just smile, pour the water into all 3 glasses, and let the silence do its sacred work. But that particular Sunday felt different, like the air before a thunderstorm when everything goes still and expectant. The father kept glancing toward the door more frequently than usual, as if some invisible thread was pulling his attention there against his will. His wife noticed. Of course she noticed, but said nothing, afraid that speaking it aloud might shatter whatever fragile thing was building in the space between hope and heartbreak. The restaurant hummed with its usual weekend buzz. Forks against plates, laughter from the bar, the soft jazz playing just loud enough to fill the gaps in conversation. Yet at their table, time moved differently, slower, like honey dripping from a spoon. The empty chair seemed almost to glow in the evening light, casting a shadow that looked less like absence and more like ... Anticipation. Something was shifting, though neither of them could name it yet. A change in the atmosphere, a whisper of homecoming carried on the wind of sacrifice and honor that only parents who've surrendered their child to orders could feel in their bones. Routine has a way of becoming religion when you're waiting for someone who might never come home. Every Sunday, without fail, they'd wake up with that same knot in their stomachs, half dread, half devotion, and go through the motions like monks performing an ancient ritual. The mother would stand in front of her closet longer than necessary, always choosing the blue cardigan her daughter loved, the one she'd borrowed a dozen times before deployment. The father would check his watch obsessively, even though they never left late, as if being punctual to their own heartbreak somehow honored the sacrifice being made thousands of miles away. They'd drive the same route, park in the same spot, walk through that restaurant door at exactly 6:30, and for 2 hours they'd pretend that normalcy was still possible. But here's what nobody tells you about waiting. It's not passive. It's the hardest work you'll ever do. Showing up week after week to a table set for 3 when your heart knows it might always be 2. The waitress Sarah, though they'd never asked her name until the 3rd month, had become an unwitting guardian of their grief. She knew the order by heart. Now, black coffee for him, herbal tea for her mother, and water with extra lemon for the empty chair, because that's how their daughter always liked it. Sarah would place the lemon wedge on the rim with such careful reverence, as if she too understood that these small acts of remembrance were the architecture holding this family together. The same order every single week: chicken parmesan for him, Caesar salad for her, and the special of the day left untouched on the 3rd plate. Growing cold while they talked around the absence, they'd discuss weather, neighbors, the garden, anything except the mission that had swallowed their daughter whole. The mother would cut her salad into smaller and smaller pieces, Borelli eating while the father would stir his coffee long after the sugar had dissolved, buying time before they'd have to stand up and admit that another Sunday had passed without her. But repetition does something strange to hope. It either kills it or crystallizes it into something unbreakable. By the 4th month, other diners had started to notice. The young couple 2 tables over, the businessman who came in every Sunday alone. Even the line cooks would peek through the kitchen window, watching this elderly couple perform their ceremony of faith. Some people thought it was sad, maybe even a little pathetic. Couldn't they just accept reality and move on? But those people didn't understand that love doesn't have an expiration date. That duty demanded sacrifice not just from the one who left, but from those who stayed behind. The promise made before deployment, when it returned dinners on me, had become more than words. It was a lifeline stretched across oceans and time zones, connecting a daughter in combat boots to parents in a small-town restaurant, all of them holding their breath, all of them believing that honor meant keeping your word even when the world gave you every reason to break it. Halfway around the world, beneath a sky that never quite looked like home, she'd close her eyes during the brief moments between orders and try to rebuild that restaurant in her mind. The smell of garlic and tomato sauce, the way the evening light would filter through those old-fashioned curtains, turning everything golden. Her father's terrible jokes that somehow got worse with age, and her mother's laugh, that particular sound that made everything feel safe, even when the world was anything but. In TD's Earth, where dust coated everything and the heat felt like punishment, she'd replay their last dinner, frame by frame, like a movie she'd watched 1,000 times but could never quite finish. She remembered her mother's hand trembling as she held the menu, pretending to decide even though she always ordered the same thing. She remembered the uniform folded carefully in her duffel bag that night, fresh and crisp, before it knew what war actually meant. That memory was her anchor, the thing she'd reach for when the mission turned dark and duty felt less like honor and more like a debt she'd never finish paying. The hardest part wasn't the danger. She'd trained for that, expected it, even embraced it in some strange way. No, the hardest part was the silence that grew between her world and theirs, like a canyon widening with each passing day. Letters took weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. Video calls were scheduled and canceled again, until hope became this fragile thing she barely dared to touch. She'd write them at night, these letters full of half-truths and carefully edited stories, trying to protect them from the weight she carried. "The food here isn't as good as that restaurant," she'd write, her handwriting shaky from exhaustion. "Miss Dad's coffee and Mom's smile. Tell Sarah I'm sorry I'm missing so many dinners. Promise I'll make it up to her when I get home." But some promises, she was learning, were easier to make than keep. The boots by the door of her temporary quarters were caked with sand and something darker. The flag on the table in the common area had witnessed things that would make civilians look away. And somewhere between the third and fourth month of deployment, hope started feeling less like faith and more like superstition, something you believed in because not believing would mean admitting you'd already lost. You know what nobody tells you about being far from home? It's not the big moments that break you, it's the small ones. The way a certain smell would trigger a memory of Sunday dinners, the sound of laughter that reminded her of her mother's voice, the impossible weight of knowing that back home her parents were probably sitting at that table right now, staring at her empty chair, aging in ways that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with worry. She'd think about the sacrifice they were making too, because deployment wasn't just hard on the one who left. It was hard on everyone who loved them, everyone who had to wake up each day not knowing if this would be the day the knock came at the door. Between missions, in those suspended moments where thoughts became dangerous, she'd wonder if they still kept the third chair, if they still ordered her water with extra lemon, if the homecoming she'd promised was becoming less real and more mythical with each sunrise, and in her darkest moments, when exhaustion made honesty unavoidable, she'd wonder if love could actually outlive this kind of dystonacer, if silence had a way of eroding even the strongest foundations, one unanswered letter at a time. There's a moment in every long wait when hope stops being a feeling and starts becoming a shuiza, deliberate, exhausting, daily choice. For her mother, that moment came on a Tuesday evening. Ironically, not even on one of their Sunday pilgrimages. She was folding laundry, her hands moving on autopilot through her daughter's old clothes that she couldn't bring herself to pack away, when she found a note tucked into a pocket from years ago. "Love you, Mom. Be back before you know it." The paper had yellowed, the ink slightly faded, and something inside her just cracked. She sat on the bedroom floor, holding that note like evidence of a crime, and realized she'd been waiting so long that her daughter's voice had started to fade from her memory. Could she still remember the exact pitch of her laugh, the way she'd hum while doing dishes? These details were slipping away like water through fingers, and the terror of forgetting felt worse than the fear of loss itself. That night, she walked into the living room where her husband sat reading, or pretending to read, and whispered words that tasted like betrayal. "Maybe it's time to stop reserving the third chair." The silence that followed was deafening. Her husband didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, the newspaper trembling slightly in his hands, and she watched decades of military discipline fight against the father who wanted to scream at the universe for demanding this kind of sacrifice. Finally, he folded the paper with mechanical precision, set it aside, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "If we stop reserving it, what does that mean?" It was the question neither of them wanted to answer, because they both knew. It meant accepting that duty and love sometimes don't get happy endings. It meant acknowledging that all those Sundays might have been dress rehearsals for a grief they'd been refusing to name. The uniform folded on the chair upstairs, the boots by the door gathering dust, the flag on the table that used to represent honor and sacrifice only, they all felt less like symbols of pride and more like relics of something already lost. The mother covered her face with her hands, not quite crying, but not quite holding it together either. And her husband did something he rarely did. He let himself break too. But here's the thing about parents who've given their children 2 orders and missions there made of something stubbornly unbreakable, even when they're shattering from the inside out. That Sunday, they almost didn't go. They sat in their car in the driveway for 15 minutes, neither speaking, both knowing this might be the week they finally surrendered to reality. The mother's hand was on the door handle, but she couldn't quite make herself pull it. One more time, her husband finally said, his voice carrying the weight of every deployment, every goodbye, every promise made in the face of impossible odds. "Let's go one more time." So they did. They walked into that restaurant with their shoulders a little more bowed, their steps a little slower, and when the hostess reached for 3 menus, the mother almost said just 2. But the word stuck in her throat like a prayer. She wasn't ready to stop praying. They sat at their corner table, and for the first time in months, neither of them could look at the empty chair without feeling like they were attending a funeral for someone who might still be alive. The silence between them grew so heavy it had texture, had weight, had teeth, and yet, somewhere beneath the doubt and the exhaustion and the grief they were practicing for, something whispered, "Not yet." Fate, it seemed, was still listening even when hope had started to sound like a memory of something they used to believe in. The universe, it turns out, has a sense of timing that defies logic and breaks hearts in the best possible way. That Sunday started like all the others. The same blue cardigan, the same obsessive watch-checking, the same drive through familiar streets that had witnessed months of their quiet pilgrimage. But from the moment they sat down, something felt different, like the air itself was holding its breath. The father couldn't stop glancing toward the entrance, his knee bouncing under the table in a nervous rhythm. His wife hadn't seen since their wedding day decades ago. She wanted to tell him to stop, to protect himself from whatever strange hope was building, but she felt it too, this electric anticipation humming just beneath her skin, irrational and undeniable. Sarah brought the water with extra lemon, placed it carefully on the 3rd setting, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she smiled differently this time. Not with pity, with certainty. The mother noticed and felt her heart stumble over its own beat, caught between terror and something she'd almost forgotten how to name. Then it happened. The doorbell above the restaurant entrance rang, that small brass bell that had announced 1,000 comings and goings, suddenly sounding like church bells on Easter morning. At first, it was just background noise in the Sunday dinner symphony. Nothing remarkable. But then it rang again, softer, as if someone had paused at the threshold, gathering courage, or maybe just savoring the moment before everything changed. The father looked up instinctively, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, and his eyes, those eyes that had held steady through deployments and wars and decades of military stoicism, went wide with something between disbelief and faith. Time didn't just slow down. It shattered into 1,000 crystalline pieces, each one catching the light of recognition. There, framed in the doorway like an answered prayer, wearing combat boots, stood their daughter. The uniform was slightly faded from months in the sun and sand, the shoulders broader from carrying weight no parent should have to imagine. But that face, God! That face was exactly as they'd replayed it in their dreams every single night. She didn't run. Neither did they. For a moment that felt like forever, they just looked at each other across that small restaurant, across months of silence and doubt and letters that never arrived, across the impossible distance between duty and love. Her smile was trembling, barely holding itself together, and tears were already streaming down her mother's face, creating rivers in carefully applied makeup that suddenly didn't matter at all. The father stood slowly, as if afraid that moving too fast might reveal this was just another dream, another cruel trick his desperate mind was playing. And then she spoke, her voice cracking on words that sounded like homecoming and sacrifice and honor, all wrapped into two simple sentences. "You kept the table. You actually kept it." It wasn't a question, it was wonder, it was gratitude. It was the sound of someone discovering that love had indeed outlived the silence, that promises made before deployment weren't just words thrown against the wind, that the boots by the door and the uniform folded on the chair and the flag on the table represented something worth coming home to. What happened next wasn't cinematic in the Hollywood sense. There was no slow-motion run, no orchestral swell. It was messier and more beautiful than that. Her mother stood so quickly her chair tipped backward, and suddenly they were moving toward each other, closing the gap that months and missions and orders had forced between them. The embrace, when it came, was everything and nothing like they'd imagined either. More desperate, more grateful. The father joined them, his arms encircling both his girls, and for the first time in months, that corner table was complete. Other diners had stopped eating, some wiping their own tears, witnesses to this small miracle of homecoming. Sarah stood by the kitchen door with her hand over her heart, understanding finally why this family had never given up their Sunday ritual. The meal that followed wasn't just dinner, it was communion. It was proof that sacrifice means something, that honor isn't just a word printed on recruitment posters, that duty and love can exist in the same breath, even when they pull in opposite directions. They ordered everything: the chicken parmesan, the Caesar salad, the special of the day that had gone cold for months unteased time. All 3 plates were cleared, all 3 glasses emptied, all 3 chairs filled with people who understood that some absences make presence sacred. As they sat there long after closing time, the owner making no move to rush them, her father asked the question that had haunted him through every silent Sunday. "Did you get our letters?" She shook her head, and something passed between them, an acknowledgment of the ways war steals even communication, even the comfort of knowing you're remembered. "But I knew," she said quietly, squeezing both their hands. "Somehow, I knew you'd be here, keeping this promise alive even when I couldn't." Her mother, who'd almost given up just days before, who'd almost asked to stop reserving the 3rd chair, looked at her daughter with eyes that had learned something profound about faith. That hope isn't foolish when it's rooted in love, that waiting isn't weakness when it's anchored in belief, that the hardest battles aren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with stubborn, unreasonable, beautiful devotion to a promise made over dinner. That night, when they finally stood to leave, the empty chair stayed behind, no longer needed, its purpose fulfilled. But none of them would forget what it represented. The space between goodbye and hello, the bridge between sacrifice and homecoming, the proof that some tables are worth waiting for, no matter how long silence tries to convince you otherwise. So here's my question for you, and I want you to really sit with this for a moment. Who are you waiting for? And more importantly, who's waiting for you? Because here's what this story teaches us that goes way beyond military deployments and restaurant tables. Every single one of us has someone in our lives who needs us to keep showing up, to keep that chair reserved, to refuse to let silence have the final word. Maybe it's a friendship that's gone quiet. Maybe it's a family member you haven't spoken to in months because pride got in the way. Maybe it's a dream you abandoned, a promise you made to yourself that you've let collect dust like those boots by the door. The question isn't whether waiting is hard. Of course, it's hard. The question is, what are you willing to believe in, even when the world hands you every logical reason to quit? Think about those parents. They could have stopped going. They could have accepted the silence, moved on, protected themselves from more disappointment. And Honestly, nobody would have blamed them. But they didn't tear Sahud up. Week after week, Sunday after Sunday, they performed this act of defiant faith that probably looked insane to everyone watching. And that's the thing about real love, real sacrifice, real honor. It doesn't care how it looks. It doesn't need applause or validation. It just keeps setting the table, keeps believing in home, keeps proving that duty and love aren't opposites, they're two sides of the same sacred coin. Now, what are you going to do with this? Are you going to close this video and scroll to the next thing? Let this story become just another emotional moment that fades by tomorrow? Or are you going to let it change something? Call that person. Send that message. Reserve that chair in your life for the thing or person you've been ready to give up on. Stop letting silence win. Stop letting distance or time or fear convince you that waiting is weakness. Because I promise you, the moment that door opens, when that promise finally comes home, when that empty chair gets filled, you'll understand why stubborn hope is the most powerful force in the universe. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that some things are worth waiting for no matter how long it takes, then do me a favor, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because we're going to keep sharing stories that remind you why love outlasts logic, why sacrifice matters, why showing up even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts is what separates those who just exist from those who truly live. There are more tables waiting to be filled, more promises that need keeping, more proof that homecomings happen to those who refuse to stop believing. And I want you here for every single one of them. So, tell me in the comments, what chair are you keeping reserved? Who or what are you refusing to give up on? Share your story, because I guarantee someone else needs to hear it. Someone else needs permission to keep hoping, to keep showing up, to keep that third seat ready for the miracle they've been waiting for. Don't just watch this. Live it. Be the person who keeps the table. Be the one who comes home. Be the proof that love and duty can dance together even when the music stops. See you next Sunday, same place. I'll save you a seat.